Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast with Joe DeLeo. You'll hear in-depth interviews and tips from world-class athletes, coaches, and industry-leading experts to help you train smarter and improve at what you love to do. Train smarter, get stronger, move better, race faster. Here's your host, Joe DeLeo.
In this episode, I sit down with co-author Phil White and we discuss the book Waterman 2.0 that he wrote with Dr. Kelly Starrett. Waterman 2.0 features unique insights and tips from more than 30 of the world's top watermen and women, including Laird Hamilton, Lenny, Emily Jackson-Troutman, and Paige Alms. This book is the start of a revolution in water sports performance. In this interview, Phil and I will share some tips and strategies that will be applicable and helpful for rowers, surfers, kayakers, and other water sports. Without further ado, let's roll to this brand new episode. I am thrilled to welcome back to the Leo Training Podcast my good friend, author Phil White. He's co-authored the books 17-Hour Fast, Game Changer, and Unplugged, and his newest book that he co-authored with Dr. Kelly Starrett, Waterman 2.0. Phil, great to hear from you. Welcome back to the show, buddy.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure. We've got a great interview in store, a lot of material to cover from the new book. So with that, let's just launch right into it. And before we get into the specific topics, why don't we talk about what the basis was for writing Waterman 2.0?
Sure. Well, really, as things sometimes do, it actually came from me trying to fix myself. So I buggered up my back deadlifting quite some years ago, and the time my wife and we've always had crappy insurance. When you're a rider, this is just comes with the territory, right? Particularly these days. And so I was like, wow, that hand grenade that just went off in my lumbar spine, that's probably going to be expensive. And so I just never got it checked. And for a while, I was actually bent sideways. I was so locked down on my left side, and it kind of started to isolate more on that left hip. And I thought, well, other than just shoveling a bunch of ibuprofen or going to get it MRI'd and then maybe having surgery or whatever, what would be kind of a third way outside of medication and or someone cutting me open? And so just did some Googling and found Kelly Starrett's videos. And this was back when it was kind of a flip phone in the parking lot at San Francisco CrossFit before they even moved into the main building there. As he calls it, the parking lot of dreams. And so, yeah, really, I just started looking at some of his videos, everything from the first, as he said, they called the first ever video, the first of many beatdowns, which was a 10-minute squat test, like just air squat and get in that bottom position and stay in it for 10 minutes every day, see what happens, to more hip and glute and lower back specific stuff. And bang, suddenly that nerve pain I'd had all the way down through somewhere where you wouldn't want it, should we say, down into my left leg that I thought was never going to go away, went away. And suddenly I was able to, and then I had a recurrence of it maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 months later when I was stand-up paddling, and I was able to just do some stuff with the glute and the hip, and a little lower back reset that Kelly had posted. And again, it went away. So I was like, damn. And so at the time I was writing for Suck the Mag, which I'm still writing for on and off. And it's the kind of stand-up paddleboarding companion to Surfer Magazine and Canoe and Kayak. And I pitched my editor because my beat was kind of health and fitness from the beginning. And I was about a year in at this point. And so I think I was doing 4 pieces a month for him, for Joe Carberry, who's now the editor-in-chief at the Inertia, who I also still write for. I said, Joe, here's the scenario. I just gave him the rundown on the phone. And, can I do a Q&A with this guy? And maybe he can give me like his top 5 mobility exercises to fix broken paddlers or something like that. And he was like, yeah, Joe's really open-minded. And he was like, I don't really know what mobility is, but sure, go ahead, do it. And Kelly was kind enough to do a kind of an exclusive video for us as well. And so we just really got on well on the phone, and we talked like every 2 or 3 months. And that was over a space of maybe year and a half. And at the time, he was starting to work with TJ Murphy on what turned out to be the book Ready to Run, which is kind of his movement manifesto for how runners should be able to move as fully functional human beings. And if they're broken and can't achieve some of those basic positions with integrity, what can they do about it, right? To fix themselves, again, without pain pills or surgery. And so really, he unbeknownst to most people, broke himself as a whitewater national team paddler back in the day. And he that set him on the road to fix himself, similar to the way I did. But whereas I looked to him to fix me through his videos, he went to PT school. And then once he found that he could fix himself, he became, set on this lifelong mission that he's still on to fix other people and share what he had learned to change lives. And so really, he felt like the paddling, surfing, and rowing community that he had come out of as a national team paddler and had to quit because his hand went numb one day, that they were even more underserved than the running community that him and TJ served so well with Ready to Run. So it was like, well, why don't we write a book that's basically ready to run, but for rowers, paddlers, and surfers? And so it took us about 7 years for various reasons, but Waterman 2.0 is the result.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So it's been this project's been a 7-year journey.
Yes, sir.
Wow. That's a lot of time invested. So, very, very cool. I appreciate all the background info there, from both your kind of perspective as well as Kelly's. So getting us up to speed. So with that, we're going to get into some very specific points and topics from the book. So kind of one of the first ones that I think is a really important concept that you and Kelly lay out early on page 8 is sort of this idea that even though we're dealing with these various water sports and that they are quote unquote non-impact compared to say running or football or hockey, there's millions of collective strokes or movements that could be taking place in a potentially poor or compromised posture. And, that idea and, looking at the impact that has on the athlete and the individual and how that is affecting, their movement capability, their performance, as well as their health.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that the whole phrase non-impact is BS from the beginning, because just because you don't have physical contact or collision with a hard surface like tarmac or a slightly less hard surface like a trail, if you're trail running, doesn't mean that there is no, quote unquote impact on the body. And so everything we do, I was actually speaking with Fraser Quelch yesterday, who is the head of training at TRX. And forgive me, Fraser, if you're listening, I know that your title's better than that, but essentially that's what his job title is. And so we were talking about the TRX RIP trainer, and he was saying that really to start, before you even start getting into moving and manipulating that device, what people do is post up in a wide stance with a wide hand position, because that's, wide offset with, with the feet, and then wide neutral grip with the hands is the most stable position with the RIP trainer, much as it, would be with most other implements. And then once you start to, figure it out, well, then we can start to look at how do we add complexity. But starting off with simplicity, just doing that and then pulling the RIP trainer to chest height and holding it there, so an isometric hold, you start to make people feel and understand what it feels like to resist rotation. And if you've ever done like a starfish plank, or even to what the regression the other way, just a side plank, you're resisting rotation there. Obviously in a get up, you're doing the same thing, but in more of the transverse plane. And so really just, even if you've got someone to stand on one leg, they're going to be resisting force. Or if you get them to air squat, say, they're going to be creating force and having to resist it through whatever plane of motion you're working in, depending on your exercise of choice. And so isometric exercises, body weight exercises are great examples of we're putting the body under load. And so in this case, if we think about an oar in rowing or a paddle, or even as a surfer, if you're prone paddling in to try to pop up and then catch a wave, even doing those things, sure, it doesn't feel like you jumped out of a tree house, that your nephew has from 25 feet and landed on the ground. But because there isn't that acute, like, holy crap moment, or there isn't the way that if you haven't run for a while and you go out and run 10K, the next day your legs are shot and you can't walk downstairs properly without kind of limping along like an old person, that belies the fact that there is always load on the system, no matter what kind of movement we're talking about. And so if you're repeating, as you alluded to, something thousands or even tens of thousands or millions of times in a certain movement pattern, and you're doing that incorrectly, it may not be now and it may not be next week, but rest assured there is going to be a reckoning and a payback for that improper movement pattern.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I just love the phrase that you said there. There will be a reckoning. When you ended the response with that, it made me think of Val Kilmer in Tombstone. So,
well
yes.
Played. And then we're going to start talking about Heat and Top Gun, right? We could.
I know. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on a tangent.
Because when you have a need for speed, then the reckoning is probably going to be sped up. Or when you have you're going to come to it sooner. Or when you add in more load or more velocity, or bounce, you start talking about balance demands, or you start talking about the conditions. You're surfing it. This is why guys that get thrown over the falls on a big wave and blow their groin out, or something else catastrophic happens. Well, a lot of the time, that's the 2% of injuries that are just catastrophic based on the conditions. But a lot of times, even with those very serious or high consequence, I guess we could call them, injuries, there has been an underlying movement pattern that has primed and made you more vulnerable to the adverse effects of a catastrophic impact. And so, sure, getting chucked over the falls of Piahi on the back of a 60-foot Hawaiian, which is not like, that's probably like 80 foot for everyone else, California. But, it's you're priming your body for not for success, but for a major problem. And so, or even like with the football player that gets tackled by, a 300-pound guy. Well, sure, you could look at that as an acute incident. But if he's been loading that right leg in such a way with, say, a valgus knee or whatever, that it's put that MCL at risk and under tension, or tried to, make something, as Chris Frankel at TRX would say, we want to look at what should be mobile and what should be stable. And if that receiver has made something that should be stable have to be mobile because of his incorrect squatting mechanics, say, or the way that he drives off that line of scrimmage over and over again, well, his MCL is primed to be torn in that tackle. So, yeah, you could look at, it's a tackle. Of course, a big guy wailing on him and forcing him into touch is going to be the cause of that. Well, it could be, that we see those kind of catastrophic injuries. But, again, if you've been in a position that's compromised your structure and asked things to do jobs that they're not qualified to do structurally, again, there will be a reckoning. And when we start to add speed, load, heavier environmental conditions, that reckoning will come quicker and often harder and more severe than if we're talking unloaded, closed environment, 2 feet firmly planted, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's a great point. That getting into sort of all of the forces and the kind of acute, or I should say not acute, but chronic trauma that the body is exposed to in a lot of these water sports. I'll make sure I link to it in the show notes, but when I gave a presentation last year on kind of spine stability and building some injury resilience for low back in the sport of rowing, one of the research articles I came across talked about, the thousands of newtons of force placed on the lumbar spine during the drive phase of the rowing stroke. So, kind of just coming back to your point, you might not have sort of these impact moments where there's a collision occurring, but there is a tremendous amount of load and forces being placed on the soft tissues and the spine during these very repetitive and explosive movements.
Yeah, and just the amount of force generated too, because again, we're not grabbing onto an oar and using that to lift a truck, or a paddle, even though I remember a great Quick Blade ad from back in the day where I think Jim Terrell and maybe Dave Kalama or Travis Grant or one of those paddlers was pulled over the side of the road, and to jack the car up on one side to change a tire, they were using a Quick Blade paddle, just to show its tensile strength. So sure, our implements are pretty strong, but our bodies maybe not so much. But I think that we forget about unless you're really into force, power meters and this kind of thing, you forget how much force you're generating off of each stroke. And again, because you don't have that, someone threw you into a wall kind of, or, oh, wow, again, my knees just dropped off this 25-foot treehouse and I was forced to land, and wow, that sure hurt. That it isn't, that acute or catastrophic incident moment that we forget. And even if you look at, there's a diagram somewhere online, and we struggled to find it and couldn't find it for the book, or couldn't recreate it. I forget which. It was probably in the early stages. But Kelly said, if I could find that again and show you how many different lines of, like, the vectors for force are acting on the shoulder during a paddle pull or a rowing stroke or whatever it is, that it's a lot of them, number one, in a lot of different directions, and they're all acting along, what Thomas Myers talks about in anatomy trains of the different lines, like along and across the body. And it's this left glute going up to this, the right back of the right posterior shoulder, and then crossing the other way. Or if you look at Jana and the cross syndromes and that kind of, it's a very complex thing. And sometimes they're linear, yes, but the lines do cross, and there's this constant push and pull. And again, if you are doing these things in a compromised position, or if your scapula, say, which is really, the shoulder blade, Kelly calls the steering wheel for the shoulder, if you're restricted in that T-spine, as a lot of rowers and paddlers are, see all pretty much, you're going to start trying to find tension, which Kelly calls, again, tension hunting, in other structures that have no business providing that stability / required tension. And then you're also going to start to try to feed slack into the system to compensate for that. And that will, again, place loads on certain other structures that have no business bearing those loads. And again, what's that going to translate to? Chronic headaches, maybe. Everyone holds tension in their shoulders, mate, and in their traps in the back of the neck and the top of the back. Sure, I could do with a freaking shoulder rub right now. And I only rode a slow 5K last night on the Concept 2. And it was very, very slow, believe me. But a recovery, bro, it was awesome. But nonsense aside, maybe it manifests itself like Kelly in your hand starting to pump out one day when you're opening a door, or as he was, like, trying to figure out his buddy's espresso machine, and suddenly he couldn't grip the portafilter to twist it into place. And then the next week, his hand went numb and stayed numb. And his head coach was like, well, it's just what happens. We're paddling multiple hours a day, 300 days a year, just probably need surgery on your neck or your shoulder. Your place is still here if you want it when you come back. You'll be fine. Everyone like you, at your age, paddling this much volume, this is just what happens. You'll be okay. And Kelly's response was, well, what do you mean that's just what happens? And if we extrapolate that, so we're saying, like, obesity is just what happens. So let's just go with obesity, or, chronic pain day to day in a resting, non-loaded state is just what happens. So we should just accept that. Or loss of function where you can't squat even to parallel anymore, let alone butt to heels without grievously rounding your spine. That's just what happens as we get older. Well, I'm getting old, my recovery sucks. It's too hard to recover these days. We can't just accept these things as a given. So while you're never going to be able to avoid injury 100% by reading Waterman 2.0, I think it's going to help you avoid some injuries, and it's also going to allow you to shine some light on these blind spots and areas that you had previously not thought about, and then also places where it might hurt. Just because something is a pain source or target doesn't mean it's the pain generator. So we start to look at a systemic approach. Well, okay, your shoulder hurts. Well, that could be tight traps. It could be a lack of mobility in your T-spine. It could be your chest is super tight. Like, you can't just look at the capsule of the shoulder and say, oh, well, it's a joint problem, go get shoulder surgery. Or even at the knee, oh, well, it's you need to have your knee scoped. Have you tried smashing your quads? Have you tried rolling out your calves? Have you tried sitting on the lacrosse ball and going after your hammies a little bit? Okay, you have, great. Let's look at your ankle. Let's look at your glutes. Maybe you just need to sit on a ball and roll around on your glutes after you row 2 or 3 times a week. Maybe that's the issue. And so we really what we're doing here is a systemic approach, and we're also trying to take a, if not this, then what approach that doesn't just involve, it's just what happens, go get surgery or start taking a handful of ibuprofen every day.
Right. And I think that's one of the things I really appreciate about the approach that Kelly takes is, the test, retest, and sort of breaking the body apart into from a systems approach, and then all these different subsystems, looking at, can you maintain a neutral spine, and then looking at the shoulder complex, and, providing sort of some standards, which we're going to get into in a moment, that you should be able to do, as a human being, and be able to, articulate and move these joints through a certain range of motion, while maintaining, a braced, neutral spine, for example. So I think it's just a really good toolbox. And I also kind of like the approach of, providing people with this information that allows them to be empowered, to start working on their body, and take control and get themselves back into being healthy.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting, mate, I appreciate you saying that. This is not a book for Olympic rowers, okay? Like, if you are an Olympic rower, you can probably benefit from it. And we have, at least one voice in there, Erin Cafaro-McKenzie, who's a double Olympic gold medalist in the women's 8. So she knows a little bit. And Kelly has also worked with the likes of Sarah Hendershot, who's another Olympic gold medalist in the US team, So legitimate folks, and on the paddling side and the surfing side too, but look past the expert names, and this is an idiot's guide enough, or 101 level enough, that I do not have a PhD. I am not a doctor of physical therapy, but Kelly is, and really my role in this whole process has been to educate myself so I could fix myself, which is basically parallel to Kelly's similar experience. Really be able to, being the layperson that I am, and then having my wife edit it, who doesn't read nonfiction at all, let alone human performance books, say this doesn't mean anything to the layperson, like this physiology term or this anatomy term, dumb it down. And then I dumb it down like, no, you're not hearing what I'm saying. Like, that is insider baseball. That doesn't mean anything. So there's enough here for the layperson that I hope I could give this to a newbie rower, to somebody that doesn't even understand what the term mobility is and shouldn't feel bad about that, but really just say, look, as you said, look, if you're going to be a fully functional human, you should be able to hit all of the standards in this book. And in the quick tests, do what Kelly thinks you're supposed to be able to do. And if you can't, here's why it matters. And here are some very, very super, super simple ways to go and change it in literally no more than 10 minutes a day. Like, if you literally mobilize 10 minutes a day, every day, and while you're performing your activity and going about your daily life, as you alluded to, you make sure that your spine is in a neutral position most of the time, that you're avoiding optional sitting, that you're avoiding locally flexing or extending your spine, that you're avoiding tilting your head too far up or down. And these very basic, very easy to implement kind of minimum effective dose pointers about how you orient your body, how you position yourself, not just in rowing, or in the gym, but just in day-to-day life. How do you sit? How do you stand? Are you eating like an arsehole? Are you sleeping poorly over and over again and expecting that isn't going to impact your body? Even some lifestyle stuff. So really just these set of minimum effective doses, mate, in a couple of minutes a day, really, like 10 minutes a day, and really no more unless you want to really go down the rabbit hole. You cannot address the kind of issue, the goats that we all have. My right ankle is shot. Kelly's right wrist and shoulder are shot for the issues I mentioned earlier. If you've ever seen him clean, he cleans with a mixed grip that I've never seen before, but it works, and it's the only way you can do it. So, it's all good. But really, what I'm saying is that this is accessible to somebody of any ability level, rower, not rower, paddler, not paddler, surfer, not surfer. And really, it's just a manual to understand a little bit better how your body is supposed to work, why it's a problem when it doesn't, and what to do about it on its simplest level. So don't be intimidated by the list of names we have on the back cover, because sure, they're great to have these expert tips and tricks, and even those are, we asked them to spin it back from Formula One level to the street car that most of us are, and I certainly am. But it is not a guide for Olympians and world champions. It is a guide for the everyday waterman and waterwoman.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point that you came back to there, because it's very well written and very clearly written, and I think a lot of the takeaways are simple in nature to execute. And that's what you're looking for, right? So if you're going to provide people with the tools to use and ask them to be trying to do 10 minutes a day on a daily basis, it has to be things that they can integrate into their lifestyle, that are, one, easy and simple enough to understand and do, but two, they don't need like a very intensive set of instructions to carry it out.
Exactly, and that's why there's an awful lot of color photos in here of Kelly doing each of the exercises. So we all are visual learners to some degree, and so I think that even if you didn't read the bloody words, the pictures should be close enough, to get you through it and do small things that over time, done consistently, add up to very big gains in performance, in injury proofing, in getting out of pain, etc.
100%. So with that, let's get into some of the standards that are laid out in the book. And the first one that we'll talk about is the very first standard, which is, can you achieve and maintain a stable spine? And so sort of some of the key points I picked out that are included under that standard that are in the text are, the importance of rib cage and spine position, as well as the role of breathing and bracing in various postures, going from supine, so laying on your back, to standing on both feet, to tall kneeling, which is on both knees. So why don't we kind of just start there?
Sure. What do you want to know about it?
So first off, why is it important for the everyday waterman or waterwoman to maintain a stable neutral spine position rather than being in a flex position through the thoracic spine? I mean, why should they care?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, the main reason, we always go spine first. We work kind of core to periphery, trunk to sleeve. And Stu McGill would agree with this, I'm sure. Gray Cook would agree on this. Pick your expert would agree on this. Anyone that knows, a spinal surgeon would say the same. And really, the spine is like the super highway or the autobahn, if you will, between the brain and the various branches of the nervous system. And so we've got to protect that. Like, there are various reflex actions we develop in the first couple of years of life to protect the head and face. And if you know anybody that has ever suffered a collision-related traumatic brain injury, you'll know a little bit more about the importance of protecting that head and spine. And so we've really got to, so we've got to protect that communication network between the brain and body, first of all. And that's just a basic hardwired human need. And then secondarily, it isn't just about the spine. Like we were talking earlier, like if your spinal position is off, it is going, and even your head position starting at the top, right? Like what sits on top of the cervical spine, your head, your noggin. So when we start to look at text neck, the phenomenon of text neck. So every degree that your neck moves forward, your head and neck move forward from your midline, that adds 10 pounds of weight to the system. So eventually the position that most people are looking at their iPads to text or send emails, check, surf the social feed, whatever, they could be effectively lugging around a 70-pound head. Like, well, if you're doing that most of the day or even several hours a day, I can't figure out why you have migraines and you have chronic neck pain and shoulder pain. That's a puzzlement to me. Well, it isn't, because stop doing that, number one. But again, nonsense aside, so what happens at the spine has, in one section of the spine, so okay, let's look at text neck. So if you're creating, as you said, like a flexion at the cervical spine, well, then your thoracic spine has to do something to compensate. And then your lumbar spine has to do something to compensate. So you can start to draw a correlation between text neck, say, or what we see in rowing and paddling under duress, where a rower or paddler's chin almost ends up on their chest, to chronic lower back pain. And it doesn't just stop there, does it? Because then that starts to affect the relationship of the lumbar spine to the pelvis. And then if the pelvis is misaligned, this bunch of suck, as Kelly would probably say, starts to travel down to the knee, and then the ankle, and then the foot. And the body then tries to recompensate further down the chain when it realizes it's under threat. So really what we're saying is that while you can feed slack into the system in a good way by mobilizing and by being in a good sustainable position, so too does excess tension feed its way up and down the system. So look at it at the other end. If your foot is ducked out or pigeoned in, that has ramifications at the knee or hip, which then need to make bigger compensations because the foot is in a crappy, unsustainable position. It then affects the pelvis, which then affects the lumbar spine, thoracic spine, cervical spine, and head. And so this travels both ways. And then the third point with the spine is that when you rotate, which is more pronounced in certain paddle sports or water sports than others, and rowing is not the most extreme example of this, but it still bears mentioning. When you rotate at the spine, up to 50% of the that are designed to protect that Google fiber connection in there that runs through the spine, up and down to the brain and back to the body, disengage. And so there is no problem if you are either in global flexion or extension. Think about the way that a strongman, go watch some World's Strongest Man Atlas Stones videos. Like that isn't a brace neutral spine at all, right? They're rounding their back, yes, but the whole back is rounded. And so we can also be in global flexion or global extension, but when you start to have a localized hinge in your spine while it is in rotation, and while 50% of those structures are disengaged, there is a vulnerability there, and that is leaving the actual spinal cord and the very sensitive nerve fibers in and around it open to damage. And so really that's the third reason that you've got to be cognizant of your spine position. And the standards, mate, are arranged in order of priority. Like that is the reason that we go spine first, because we have to work, again, core to periphery and trunk to sleep, to just protect ourselves as an organism so that we can perpetuate, let alone just perform.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, the working from the core to the sleeve, as you said, key point there for the audience to take away and fold back into their own training. One other thing that you said that was really interesting. You talked about when we undergo rotation, 50% of, I believe you said the rings. Is that correct? Around
Essentially, yeah, 101 level, yeah.
So I was just curious, do we know why they disengage or turn off when we rotate? Do we know why that happens?
That'd be a Kelly question, mate, I'm afraid, or a Stu McGill, because again, I'm not, and neither do I purport to be either a coach or indeed a PhD in one of those disciplines that could tell you that. So no, I don't personally know, but they would know. Kelly would certainly know.
Sure.
But it's just the way it just, that is what happens. So
no, yeah,
it does happen. And yeah. what then happens if you start again flexing at the neck, if your chin is down, looking up, we sometimes see as well. And then the other parts of the spine have to compensate. And then the soft tissues, we can start to get that pinching in between those segments. And then we start to get into stenosis and other serious, discompression, serious issues that are, I wouldn't say perfectly avoidable, but somewhat avoidable if we maintain either a globally flexed, globally extended, or brace neutral spine. We will hopefully not run into those issues, or they will be less pronounced than if we are, we're horribly hunched over, any part of the spine, or we're almost arching backwards. Like if you picked up a rock in a deadlift position and threw it over your head, I guess it's the opposite of the Atlas Stones position. Well, that's fine. And you can do that, with load and explosively. And as long as you're doing it right, you're fine. What would not be fine is if you try to apply that same force where only part of your spine is going in and you're almost flexing back on yourself the other way. Well, then you're going to have a freaking problem. And we see this in rowing, paddling, surfing, people walking down the street looking at their phones. It's just a society-wide and a sport-wide problem.
Yes. Yeah. Great point there. Great point. So did you have anything else that you wanted to add on standard one before we shift to the second standard?
Mm-mm.
Okay. Excellent.
No, man, go ahead.
So second standard is, can you hinge from the hips without sacrificing stiffness? So most people are probably going to know what a hip hinge is, but why don't we sort of define what we mean by stiffness, so people don't get the image of somebody walking like Frankenstein's monster.
Just required tension to stay in an organized position. So when you hip hinge, your torso should be parallel to the ground, basically, is what we're saying. And if you the writing of Dan John, and if you don't know who Dan John is, look him up and read his stuff because it's excellent. One of the most influential minds in strength and conditioning in the last probably 50 years. He says that hip hinging, and in an athletic context, there's a hinge involved in rowing, in paddling certainly. And obviously, when we start to talk about kettlebell swings, one arm or two arm, deadlifting, this kind of thing, these are all hinges. Or even if you're just, you could be, sure, we could argue you could get into a deep squat to pick up an Amazon box, right, that's left on your doorstep, but you could also hinge and pick it up. So the difference between you bending over to get that box with a requisite tension there to preserve that spine, preserve that neutral spine. So basically you're parallel to the ground versus you bending over to get that box and you're all bent in the middle of your back. That's really the compare and contrast I would offer there.
Excellent. Great. So from that, we talk about hinging from the hips. And so you and Kelly lay out sort of a few different positions as well as placing the body under different types of load. So we progress from sort of the most simple to kind of the most complex. So we have the long sit position, which is sitting on the floor, feet together, outstretched in front of you, and being able to essentially pivot from or hinge from the hip, bending forward while maintaining a nice tall posture, neutral spine. Second one's a single leg deadlift, then standing, 2-leg hip hinge, and then we progress to one arm kettlebell swing. Right? Did I have them all down there? That's correct.
Yeah.
Excellent. So first one. So let's talk about the long sit. So we have sports like rowing, kayaking. These are probably going to be most relevant to those two, because with surfing we're popping up, and then stand-up paddleboarding we're standing as well. But for kayaking and rowing, we will be in a seated position, and you can have a very strong tendency, either through fatigue or just the way you're taught, poor mechanics, to really be slumped over through the upper back. So what we're working on here is being able to maintain that stiffness through the core, hinging through the hips, and maintaining a tall neutral spine.
With motion, preferably, yes, because as you said, we started off in a static position with a static long sit, and then we start to provide some, if you can't do this step in the progression, do it with a band, so that you have to resist it a little bit and resist that pull against you, and that's going to loosen some stuff up and feed some slack into the system. So every time we start to try to use a progression to identify somebody's limitation or sticking point, we're also providing an exercise or a suggested set of exercises from the mobility appendix at the end of the book to try to remedy that. But yes, your point is correct. We start off unloaded in a static position, but then you should be able to move right to the end with, in the case of our own exercises here, a single arm kettlebell swing, but in the case of a lot of the people listening, being able to row either on the water or on your erg. And so managing to obtain and maintain postural integrity, i.e. a good position that isn't placing your system at risk, with motion, with force, with velocity.
Yes. So clearly these are some things that are very well laid out in the book. As you said, there's some excellent photographs of sort of the position that we're striving to achieve, as well as sort of a compromised or weaker position that's going to place additional stress on the spine as well as the tissues, and how that can kind of affect, as we've talked about throughout the podcast so far, upstream and downstream throughout the entire system. So I was just curious, do we have did you and Kelly kind of discuss, we went from sort of that seated position to a single leg deadlift, and then we went to a standing two-legged hip hinge. So in terms of kind of complexity, wouldn't the single leg stance be a little bit more demanding in terms of balance? So I was just curious, was there a reason for putting that before being on both feet?
Yeah, I think it's partly because a lot of what we're talking about in the book is asymmetrical loads. So if you're in one side of a rowboat, you're going to be subject to an exaggerated asymmetrical load. If you're stand-up paddling on a windy day and you have to paddle all on your right side, at least one way, and only one way if you're in Hawaii and it's super windy, because all you can do is a downwinder in that case. But and so yeah, really what we're trying to say is, look, we're on dry land, but we are trying to consider the demands of your sport as well. And so let's throw a little need for balance into the equation. And then also, some people find, well, if opposite arm, if left arm and right leg are doing this, then, it a bit more realistic almost to any sport. So even if you look at, say, tennis or something like that, or baseball, there is that kind of counter rotation there to balance opposing forces. And so we're really just trying to give a little glimpse into, it looks like jumping ahead, but it's really not if we're trying to apply it then to a real world context. That's
great. Yeah, I love that. And balance isn't probably something we typically think of, but it's so key for pretty much all of these various water sports across the board. And that type of standard, with the single leg deadlift, body weight, it really will expose an imbalance or deficiency between the left and right side of the body.
Yeah, exactly. And even if you think about rowing, I remember in Boys in the Boat, they talk about the big kind of training barges that they would often have the incoming freshmen start in, because if most of them got in a shell, they tip it. Well, why is that? It's because it's narrow and because they don't know how to balance it, and a lot of them were walk-ons that had never rowed before. So in thinking about that, that makes me want to go and freaking reread that book, because I love it. And it's a great human story beyond anything, beyond being a rowing story as well. But, so even in something like rowing, like I think that, or even in stand-up paddleboarding, why does Laird Hamilton recommend that people start off on the widest and longest board they can find? Because he said it's called stand-up paddleboarding. It's not called fall over in the water every 5 seconds boarding. And so, sure, the guys like Connor Baxter or Kai Lenny that are winning Molokai or any of the races are on little 24-inch wide bullets, that are 14 or 17 feet long. But while you want that length for a beginner, you also need some width as well, to Laird's point. And so yeah, I think that even in rowing, maybe that balance, and you could speak to this better than I as a rowing coach, and I'm not, but that balance component is somewhat underrated, particularly if you get down to the smallest craft in your sport.
Yeah, 100%. It's a key athletic quality. And some of the athletes you just mentioned, they may be using equipment that is a lot narrower now, but I'd be, willing to wager that when they first started in the sport, they probably didn't begin there. They were probably using a wider board.
Well, and there was just a lack of equipment to begin with. Like the Mickey Munoz longboard was the original stand-up paddleboard. And then it was the two that I have in my garage. They're Laird's brand, but within Surf Tech, and kind of like a little subsidiary line they had going for a while. They're soft tops. They're super thick, so there's a lot of volume when you add that to the width and the length. It's about as wide as an aircraft carrier. And it has almost no glide. And that's not a knock on Laird or on Ron House, who shaped those boards, but rather it's saying they're smart and they understood that they were looking at the consumer market for the first time. And that's the only, those are the only two boards available. And so even when people were racing, that's all they had access to, was something that was 4 or 5 inches thick, that was 32.5 inches wide, was 12'1" long. And that was it. That was before we got into now the unlimited boards of like 16, 17 feet, or even a 14-foot class, or division. You didn't have these little arrows shaped by guys like Joe Bark, who's one of my favorite interviewees, the great paddleboard, both prone and stand-up board manufacturer that loves his job more than anyone has ever loved any job. Before we had that, and similar with the paddles, I mean, before Jim Terrell at Quickblade was doing his thing and creating these, I think the kids paddle now they have is 11 ounces and super thin shaft, because it's meant to be for kid-sized bodies, right? It's not just about, don't give your kids an adult paddle. It's about the thickness. It's about the blade size. We didn't have these tailored equipment, like my friend Shane Perrin started a distance paddler from St. Louis, started off with a homemade paddle that he called the Hammer, that he told me weighed like 5.5 pounds. And so it's partly what you said, but I think it's partly too just about the evolution of the sport. And we probably see the same, sure, these new fancy concept tours that are awesome were great. Or even if you look at the erg, like there's a massive difference between a Model D and E and a Model A, which was essentially looked like it was made from bicycle parts, because it probably was.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, the huge evolution in the equipment as those respective sports have progressed. It's pretty incredible. And also interesting kind of from the rowing perspective. One of the things a colleague of mine, Will Ruth, who's a strength and conditioning coach and works with rowers, he did a big article on some of the rowing injuries and looked at a lot of the research. And the force vectors, placed on the body are a lot higher with the hatchet blades, and they've been able to kind of find that. So if you look at as the equipment has improved in terms of being able to generate greater boat speed, right? So the times are going faster, the event is becoming more competitive. The point that we're really probably becoming much more cognizant of is the body has been placed under greater and greater demands and stresses.
Yeah, but it's interesting, mate. One more, and sorry to take you on a tangent, but it just something that Kelly and I discussed a lot in the writing of this book came up in my mind. So forgive me if I can lead you on a little tangent. So with this newer equipment, we start to see, even with, and not to pick on Nike, I'll probably get sued, but with the quest for the 2-hour marathon, right? And they couldn't get the guy under it, and he recently set the marathon world record without a pacer, at 2:01 or something in Berlin, which is great. And I think Alex Hutchinson and Brad Stulberg did some great writing outside on the magnitude of that. But before they got the guy real close to 2 hours with like a wedge-shaped formation of pacers, on this racetrack and all this stuff. Well, they claim now that the consumer version of that shoe, I believe, the Vaporfly, tried, 4% more efficient or something like that. So say, for the sake of shits and giggles, that, an oar manufacturer said this oar makes your stroke 4% more efficient, okay, just for an apples for apples comparison. Well, my question is, what if you were missing 40% of your internal rotation at both shoulders? And then through doing the exercises in this book and on Kelly's website, mobilitywod.com, which is not to plug it, but check it out if you want a deeper dive than the book gives you, because there's daily stuff on there that you'll find helpful. What if, or even if you did one of the exercises in the book and it gave you back half of that? So it gave you back 20% of the internal rotation you were missing at the shoulder. The impact of that is going to be so much greater than this carbon fiber ore that even if it was true that it made you 4% more efficient, which parentheses it probably isn't, it's just marketing hype. We're talking about like worrying about the placement of sand and pebbles before we get the big rocks in place. And we're also talking about turning the minors into the majors. So we look at like the theory of marginal gains with the British cycling team, with Team Sky and all this. But Dave Brailsford and those guys did not start looking at these tiny little incremental things of having their athletes travel with their own pillow because it would feel more familiar and smell more familiar, and they'd probably get a better night's sleep in a hotel. They would not have messed with that unless they had first looked at hip mechanics and range of motion and tried to clear up any impingements at the hip. Okay, they would not have looked at trying to shave a few more grams off the weight of the bike if they had not first looked at sleep hygiene or nutritional strategy. And so we really need to start taking care of some of the major, like take the parking brake off first, and then we can send you to the shop to maybe have the engine tuned a little bit. But if you're rowing with the parking brake on, which manifests itself again at the hip, the shoulder, your spine position, environmental factors, you sleeping like crap, you eating like crap. If we can start to remove some of these major roadblocks, then we can start to look for some of the little potholes, which sure are annoying or might even be a little jarring occasionally, but they're not the major thing that are holding you back from your potential. Your own body is, and your understanding or lack thereof is the problem. And so this book is really an attempt to try to fix some of those, remove the roadblocks, take the parking brake off a little bit, and have you really do these things that are going to lead to major boosts, not just in your overall health or protecting your spine, but also greatly improving your performance by leaps and bounds, not by marginal gain margins, to use the word margins twice.
Yes, you brought up some excellent points, and I'm actually very glad that you shared all of that information, because I think it's very easy to kind of get caught up in, whatever the latest the latest gadget or gizmo or piece of equipment that, we look at it as the magic bullet or the magic pill. Because, unfortunately, probably, even more so today than ever before, is we want the quick fix. We want the instant gratification. And the truth of the matter is that, most of these things, these issues that people have that are underlying, are resolvable, and can clear themselves up. But one, it takes work, and kind of a commitment in daily practice. And two, you didn't get there overnight. So, it's not going to clear itself up. It'll improve, it'll get better. You can see, pretty quick progress, like you said, in 10 minutes or less, if you're being targeted and precise with what you need to do in terms of, some of the applications of the exercises. But you didn't get here overnight in terms of having all of these deficiencies. There's probably been sort of, signals and warning signs along the way that we either are ignorant to or completely passed us by.
Or the equipment itself buffers, which is why these max shoes, that's kind of a pendulum swing against the barefoot running movement or the zero drop or minimal running movement. If you put 2 inches of foam between you and the pavement, you can get away with a lot more crap in your stride than somebody who is in a more minimal shoe or no shoe at all. And so it's not saying that we should all go barefoot, which is that was never Chris McDougall's intention in writing Born to Run. What he was saying is you shouldn't, we're designed with these mechanics, and you should gradually cycle down to as close to zero drop or as close to barefoot as you can probably get, because that's how we're designed as humans. But do that gradually, and I think then conversely, Mahi Drysdale again, to go back to Boys in the Boat, in a George Pocock cedarwood shell, is going to kick your arse when you are in your carbon fiber shell with your carbon fiber blade, or in this shape of blade. It's not going to make a damn bit of difference. Just like if you challenge John McEnroe now, and John McEnroe had a wooden racket, unless your name is Andy Murray or your name is Roger Federer, he is not just going to beat you. It's going to be 6-love, 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 and he could probably do it blindfolded with both hands tied behind his back. You would stand no. And that's similar to what David Epstein talked about in that presentation he did on has athletic performance really improved, and they kind of looked at the Canadian sprinter Andre de Grasse, and they put him in, the same kind of shoes Jesse Owens would have worn, had him run on a cinder track, heavy cotton clothing, and he only was just ahead. And I think Epstein's point was Usain Bolt probably would have beaten Jesse Owens, but it would have been a stride length or maybe less, even with that beautiful long gazelle stride that we can all envisage as I'm talking about this. And so I guess I went on dual tangents there, but just you cannot out equipment body-based or lack of understanding of the human body-based faults. It just does no amount of $200 shoes, $3,000 shells, even $2,000 online coaching programs, if not implemented by a coach who understands that it has to be body first and spine first and work from there, it's not going to be able to fix. You can throw as much money, and we see this in triathlon probably more than anything, like the arms race around gear to shave off a few more grams, to get the latest monitoring, to monitor more and more and more. It really gives you less in terms of understanding of your body. And as I mentioned, with the 2 inches of foam when you're freaking Hoka ones or whatever it is, it can actually, sometimes the equipment can deaden your connection between yourself and the water, or yourself and whatever surface you're playing on, to the point where you bugger yourself up for life if you're not careful.
Yeah.
Technology doesn't always equal progress.
100%. Yeah, that's a great way to summarize right there. And you can't, outwork the deficiencies of your body if you're not operating optimally. So So one of the other standards or progressions for that standards of the hip hinge without sacrificing stiffness is we kind of finish up with the one arm kettlebell swing, and that's to test integrity of a neutral brace spine. So I had to ask because I'm a kettlebell instructor and kettlebell enthusiast, and I think they have a tremendous amount of application for the everyday person, but a tremendous amount of carryover to rowers because you're really working on a lot of the qualities that we've discussed this entire interview, as well as developing horizontal power, which is what you need for good sports transference in the sport of rowing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think with the one arm kettlebell swing, Kelly prefers it to a two arm swing usually because you're also having to resist rotation to a greater degree, kind of like contralateral rotation. And so that's the reason we put a one arm swing in there, not a two arm swing. And again, that's more transferable to your sport because sports, like most of them are I already mentioned the tennis example just now. Tennis is one, but every kind of water sport to some degree is going to be have some kind of asymmetrical load. Even like in swimming, if you had 40 strokes on your left side and 40 strokes on your right, while you're performing that stroke on the left or right side, it's still an asymmetrical load, even though overall you may be taking the same number of strokes on each side. Or the same in paddleboarding, like if you use like a 5-5 or a 10-10, if there's no wind and your lake or your surface is glassy. So you're like, oh, well, it was an even load because I took, even if you figured it out to the geeky degree of like, oh, I took 3,000 strokes on one side and 3,000 on the other. Yeah, but while you were performing it, it was still asymmetrical. So hence why the one-arm kettlebell swing. And when we get into the carries, the overhead carries and things like that, that's again why those are one-arm. Why Gray Cook came up with that three-position kind of suitcase carry to front rack carry to overhead carry, because it creates the demand to resist rotation on the other side.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. So awesome, kind of bringing that home there and showing the purpose of that standard and that test, and then also kind of the benefits of how it can help sort of bring a little bit more balance back to the human body. So one of the other tests in there that I really like, and I'm going to play around with myself as well as use with some athletes is the worm to plank test. And so why don't you kind of describe what that is, and then we can kind of talk about sort of how that applies to some of the different water sports. And I had some thoughts I wanted to run by you as well.
Yeah, so basically what we're trying to do is you see these surfers with a kind of a spondy spine, I guess we would say. So when they pop up, if they're doing that incorrectly, they are loading that lumbar spine, like jamming that hinge shut so freaking hard, and they do it so many times that they end up in imagine a Marine, like the posture that you would think of a Marine or, British Special Forces SAS or, Navy SEALs, pick one, where, it's the classic, be upright, puff your chest out, etc. So like really good day-to-day posture. But then imagine if you ask someone to go, okay, can you go even further than that? And they would start to almost arch their back like a cat. Well, that is what I'm talking about with the spondy spine, and that's kind of that pop-up related problem that surfers tend to have. And so really with the one to plank, what we also make the analogy on the other end of trying to use a gym exercise, which is the burpee as well with this. Like you've got to be able to do that better. Like you've got to be able to pop up better. And even if you're not a surfer who's popping up, you've got to be able to understand the various stages, if we break it down into stages of what's happening there. And again, the burpee is kind of, twinned with this, and we should look at it as one. And so really, Kelly also reverse engineered it in over thousands of hours of running a gym, as he does at San Francisco CrossFit, across more than 10 years. What are some of the common faults in the burpee? And so even in the plank, you see the hips start to sag, which is why a cue is to, make your body like a surfboard so it's rigid. That doesn't happen. Maybe even just as simple as screwing your hands into the ground. So your hands are straight and neutral, but almost imagine like you were turning your left hand counterclockwise and your right hand